Zika is no longer the threat it was 3 years ago, but as we just saw in the documentary, thousands are still feeling the impacts. Here to discuss is CBS News Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Jon LaPook. Jon, thanks so much for being here. I mean, you've covered this so extensively. The question now is, what have we learned about the Zika virus in the last 3 years?
We have learned a ton, given that we didn't know anything practically at the beginning of it. It really kind of caught us by surprise. First of all, we found out that it can cause microcephaly, and it can cause microcephaly especially if the pregnant woman is infected earlier in the pregnancy. So that was one thing. And then we learned this whole congenital Zika syndrome, which is, it wasn't just microcephaly. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? Which was so dramatic to see. And I remember being in Recife, and I actually saw these babies, and it just takes your breath away. But then it turns out that they also have problem with their vision. They can have problem with their hearing, with their joints. So there's this whole syndrome, and then their developmental problems swallowing. And I just read a paper talking about, is there some association with cognitive function?
Interesting. Well, where do things stand now with Zika today? I mean, people are wondering, what's the risk, for instance, of contracting Zika now?
Well, I was on the CDC website. You can click by year. And by the way, I would just say that to all the listeners who were wondering, I'm going somewhere, am I going to get Zika? Do I have to worry about it? You Google CDC space Zika space place where you're going, and it'll tell you whether there's active infection. And it peaked in around 2016. It fell off dramatically in 2017. In 2018, it really went down to a trickle. But one of the problems, and there's some controversy over this, is that are we still looking for it as vigorously as we should be? And even the microcephaly, it seemed to be concentrated largely in Brazil, especially in the Northeast, in that epicenter which you went back to. It stands that it's much lower. We're certainly not seeing the huge number of cases we saw in the past. Part of it may be burned out. Maybe there's immunity now locally. People have gotten infected and they've gotten immunity to it. But I would say there's an asterisk. You shouldn't let your guard down, and you should always be checking if you're going to a place, especially if you're pregnant or you're thinking of becoming pregnant, on that vacation. I would be very careful about, stay away from it. If you're pregnant, you stay away from any of these areas.
Remind us again, what are the symptoms of Zika? Yeah,
you can have a headache, a fever, joint pain, a little rash, conjunctivitis. I actually saw a woman who had it when I was there. It was a sister of one of the doctors. And the rash was very unimpressive, just a little sort of pinkish thing. You press it and it sort of blanches. But yes, it can be quite mild, and 80% of the time, people get infected. They may not even know it. So it's very prevalent.
Let's say, Jon, that somebody is concerned. She's pregnant. She's concerned. Maybe she has that little bit of a rash. Maybe she has a little bit of a fever, but isn't sure. And she was in one of these locations. What should she do? Is there anything she can do?
Well, once you become infected, we have. I don't know of any way that you can interrupt the natural history of what's going to happen. So if you get those symptoms, though, you report it right away to your OB, to your doctor. You'll get tested, because everything that is a rash isn't necessarily Zika. And if you're in one of the areas, if you have to be there, you have to take precautions, which means the stuff we talked about last time, 3 years ago, which are using DEET, covering up. If you're in a home, get rid of any kind of little areas of water, because the mosquitoes, the Aedes aegypti mosquito breeds, in a thimble. It can do that. Make sure there's air conditioning if you can have it, if you can't afford it, but then you can't. There's nothing you can do about that. But make sure that the screens are intact.
Can you just explain what we understand microcephaly to be right now, and what does it mean for families then who are trying to look down the road and figure out what kind of needs their child may have in the future?
We're finding this out, right? There are now all these studies going forward. That was one of the big questions 3 years ago, is what happens to them. Microcephaly is a smaller than usual brain. And it happens because the virus infects it in the middle of the crucial periods of development, which is why earlier is worse than later. It's possible to get infected towards the end of the pregnancy and be relatively okay. Or
because the brain's already formed.
Brain's already formed, everything's fine. There's no period where you're absolutely safe, but it's much worse earlier when everything's dividing quickly. For these families, I know, they're being studied in various places. they have huge challenges, not to mention physical therapy, occupational therapy, all that. I mean, who's going to pay for that? Who's doing it?
How much of a concern is there about an outbreak happening again?
I think it's always a possibility, especially in areas where there's no immunity to it.
Yeah.
So we were all worried about the southern part of the United States, the Gulf Coast, right? And it's not that the mosquitoes are going to fly up from South America and infect the North America, because they only fly maybe a half a mile at most in their entire life. What happens is a traveler gets bit. A traveler comes and has the virus in the bloodstream, and comes to an area of the United States where the mosquitoes don't have it, and that mosquito bites the person, and the person gives the mosquito Zika, and then that mosquito turns around and bites somebody who is uninfected, and then boom, you have local transmission. That's one thing. Two, we've got deforestation, we've got climate change, all these things that, because of deforestation, we've got, you know, the things like the bats and the animals, they're closer to civilization, right? There's a bigger chance for infection there. And then you have changes with climate, and all this together increases the risk that you're going to have some other outbreak of something.
There's so much that we don't know, but Dr. Jon LaPook, thanks so much for helping us understand what we do know about Zika right now. Appreciate it. Coming up, Dr. Jon LaPook takes us back to 2016 when he traveled to Brazil to report at the height of the Zika outbreak. We'll also hear how the virus impacted tourism in affected countries and if it's safe to return. This is CBSN, CBS News, always on.